So before we get into any real detail about Night Below itself, we're actually going to look at the original box set. Look at what was included, the different handouts and maps and booklets and so on and so forth that were in the original box set, and kind of go over what they're all for before we get into how I ran it in 5th edition and what changes I would make if I were to run it again. This is my copy of Night Below. The cover art is really cool. I've always liked this cover. Mine is also, for what it's worth, a little beat up. I did get it second hand, and not only did I get it second hand, but the copy that I received was not complete, so I actually had to go back and print some of the missing components from the copy that I actually purchased. I will readily admit as well that it is possible that I missed something. There may be a missing handout in here somewhere, but inside this box should be 3 64-page books comprising a single grand-scale adventure which can be placed in any AD&D campaign world. 16 player handout sheets including art, maps, charts, and letters. 8 Dungeon Master reference cards providing cutouts, monster rosters, and 2 new evil deities. An 8-page booklet of new monstrous compendium entries detailing 3 new races and 2 new monsters. And 6 full-color poster maps detailing all the important locations of the campaign setting. We get a little summary of the campaign: a missing mage, a ruthless band of kidnappers, a sinister conspiracy. We see that this is a campaign-length adventure, similar in scope to a lot of today's 5th edition hardback adventure books. We find out that the first book is supposed to carry PCs up to 5th level, and that by the end of the story, they should be 10th level or above. So let's crack this thing open and see what the contents are. And actually, I'm going to do this. I'm going to flip these so that we can see the back as we go through these, and we'll set them off to the side. So we start out with a map of Milbourne, and Milbourne is one of the first settlements that the PCs will discover. It is the piece of civilization that my players across multiple campaigns have spent the most time in. So it's a town that you definitely want to get to know and perhaps even flesh out more than the book gives you. On the back we get Thurmaster, which is the other settlement. I have always been a little annoyed that Milbourne gets a color map and Thurmaster does not. It's always been kind of annoying to me. I don't know the design decision that went into making this color on one side and black and white on the other. I've got a feeling it was probably printing costs, but man, I feel like that's such a missed opportunity. But in any case, we'll move right along. We've got some more reference cards here for the DM. These are all different hazards that players can encounter in mainly Book 2 as they're kind of exploring the Underdark. Things like fungi and oozes that are actually like monster encounters. Glass rock, which is super slippery and honestly more annoying than dangerous, but if you pair it with certain kinds of encounters, it can make them very interesting. We've got Razor Rock, which is legitimately dangerous, like walk through it too fast and you cut up your feet, and other things. Wormholes, where players may or may not encounter purple worms, which a classic D&D monster that is always fun to run in games. Then we've got the City of the Glasspool monster roster with all the stats of all the major NPCs and things of that location. This is absolutely useless now, unless you're running it in the original AD&D. I don't anymore, but hey, OSR is a thing, and so there may be some old school folks who would run this with original or slightly modified stats. There's the social collapse point system, which we'll talk about a little bit more when we go over Book 2, but it is an interesting take on how you can set up the downfall of a city by essentially disrupting the social constructs and people and places and things that the town relies on to function. Then we've got the Blood Queen and Ilksindrin. So these are both deities of different Underdark races. The Aboleth in one case and Ixen in the other. I have never actually used these as the religious leanings of the bad guys in this campaign. I've never seen come into play, but it's kind of interesting reading regardless. And we've got another handout on the Grand Savant, who is the final bad guy players will encounter. It's kind of a massive albino aboleth. And then the sister document to the monster roster of the other big monster city, the Great Shaboeth, which again, I don't use anymore because I'm not running AD&D. But I guess kind of helpful to know what stuff is in there, but I feel like nowadays you do better with a little bulleted list because the stats aren't useful anymore. Then we move on to the Monsters Compendium insert. This was all the rage back in like 2nd edition because the idea was you could collect all these different Monsters Compendium inserts and then you could just 3-hole punch them and put them in a 3-ring binder and have a giant collection of monsters that you pulled from adventures and supplements from all over the place. I never actually used them that way, but you could have. And the stats are not helpful anymore, but at least here you have a lot of background information on each of the monsters that's portrayed, so that's pretty cool. Then we move on to player handouts, and these are some of the ones that I had to print out because in my original copy these were actually cut to pieces. I assume they had actually been handed to players physically in the previous owner's campaign. It was only the first handful. I'm guessing they got through like the middle of book 2 before they sold it, but I went back and printed out the handouts on paper myself. So player copies of the 2 main towns, Milbourne and Thurmaster. A listing of all the map locations that the players might know a little bit about prior to actually visiting those in the campaign. So you got little like rumors that they may hear, or if players rolled high enough on a history check or whatever, these are things that they might have come up with. We've got some player maps of locations, maps of the Garlstone Mines, which is one of the locations that you hit kind of probably 2/3 of the way through the first book, give or take, as you're tracking down all the kidnappings in the campaign. Some various items that the players pick up along the way, a letter from an NPC, more maps and items, more letters, typical campaign handout things. This is the map from the 2nd book that kind of outlines the Underdark tunnels that the players are likely to explore or spend most of their time exploring until they make it to the city of the Glass Pool. Some more letters that they may come across. I used very few of these in my last running of the campaign, but more items, more maps. And then as we near the end, we get a map of the actual Sunless Sea, which encompasses the entirety of the 3rd book of play, and Great Shaboeth, where they will have their final showdown with the BBG and the surrounding area, where they have kind of a big sandbox to play in and explore before they dive into the center. More handouts, letters and such. This is the actual map of Great Shaboeth, or at least the player version of it that they can find. And we end there. On to the poster maps. So these are kind of hit or miss, in my opinion. I love the Heronshire map. I think it is kind of old school, but the artwork is good enough that I feel like it holds up. I actually used this in my most recent campaign. I replaced most of the other maps entirely and used almost nothing map-wise from the rest of the campaign, but this one I still used. As we open it, you can see kind of the art style of the set, and I'm not going to show all of these because, to be honest, the map style is very similar across all the maps. Almost everyone on here is a brown background with this little like light tan gridded area in this style, which is fine, but compared to newer maps that we have today that we're used to seeing in VTTs, it just hurts my eyes a little bit in comparison, so I scrapped all of these. The other side of this, we do have a tactical map. And I don't actually remember where this is. I believe this is from Ranchifus's area, where you would fight one of the bigger players in the kidnapping plots prior to entering the Underdark itself. Even though this map is the closest to what I consider our expectations of what a battle map should be, I still found better things to do. And if my players actually didn't encounter him here, but if they had, I had a map set from Heroic Maps that I was planning to use, and I'll share a link to that down in the description. And you can see, actually let me do the other one first because that's mostly book 3. Book 2 maps, you can see the style pretty similar across all of these. You have brown background, light tan, places where people could walk, and yes, the different structures in the map are different, but the color scheme is exactly the same across all of them. And looking at this over a long period of time as a player, I would get bored. So I replaced all of these, literally all of these. I'll flip this open though, because there is another encounter map on the back. And this one is big. In fact, it's not even going to fit in my camera. But again, another map that I did not use. But this technically is very usable by today's standards. I just felt like I could do better. Between Heroic Maps and Gabriel Pickard and, or is it Picard? I can never remember. I pronounced it incorrectly for a long time. And now I can't remember. Anyway, what I was trying to say though is we have so many better mapping assets than some of these mid-90s options. But yeah, lots of maps. And then the last thing we get is the actual books. And there are 3. Let me set this out of the way entirely. We get book 1, book 2, book 3. And the structure of each book is pretty similar across the entire campaign. Each book starts with a broad sandboxy kind of area with lots of location-based mini-adventures that kind of lead the players into a bottleneck that has to be completed before moving on to the next book. The first book, for example, covers Heronshire and the uppermost Underdark caves. For the most part, players can just wander around the region, do things in whatever order makes the most sense, but they can't move forward to book 2 until they deal with the Bloodskull orcs. The second book functions pretty much the same way. They're in the Underdark. They actually have a little less room to maneuver as far as doing things in any order that they want, just because of the way the map forces them down certain tunnels. But essentially it's the same thing. They have to go through this big broad section of the Underdark before they get through the City of the Glass Pool and can move on to book 3. And then with book 3, big, large, sandboxy location that they can explore until they're ready to take on the big bad in the center of the map in Great Shaboeth. The structure I like a lot because each book technically could kind of fill the role of its own campaign. I actually have used the second book individually without either of the others just to plot out a section of Underdark travel for a campaign that I was running back when I was running Pathfinder, and it worked fairly well. There's a lot of criticism that the second book is the weakest link among the 3. I kind of agree with that, but I also think that it is the easiest to fix. I think there are a lot of things in book 3 that are difficult for me as a DM, and that are harder to fix. But book 2, even though there are parts that I don't love and parts that could be improved on, those improvements are really easy to implement without throwing off the adventure itself. We will cover each of these books individually in future videos, and so I'm going to wrap it up with that. If you happen to find yourself here without knowing that there was a playlist where we are going through the Night Below campaign piece by piece and talking our way through it and talking about how I ran it in 5th edition on Foundry Virtual Tabletop, then I would love to have you check out that playlist, see what's there, and drop me some comments and let me know what you'd like to hear more of in this series and others. Happy gaming, everybody. See you next time.